brief introduction and then get started.
Okay, our topic was Children's Subject Heading Lists in Library of Congress. Oops. All right, first up, the intended purpose of Children's Subject Headings. They're designed to complement the Library of Congress subject headings and to provide better access to children's materials. They are mainly used in libraries with children's collections, and they have been modified for children. So, for example, children's parties would simply just become parties. These differ from standard libraries because they provide a brief summary, and also because the children's and young adult subject headings list has a controlled vocabulary, which as of July of 2021 is completely separate from Library of Congress subject headings. The children and young adult catalogs would prepare bibliographic records for materials in scope with the children's and young adult catalog program using MARC format standards, RAC guidelines, valid Library of Congress subject headings, and children's and young adult cataloging subject headings, and current LC and CYAC cataloging policies and practices. The history of this program is in 1965, the Library of Congress initiated the annotated card program to provide a more appropriate and in-depth subject matter treatment of juveniles' works. Some headings were changed or simplified. This was done by reducing the length of subject streams and by using subdivisions. In 1969, the first edition of Subject Headings for Children's Literature was published. This edition outlined exceptions to the Library of Congress subject headings. The Library of Congress subject headings and Children and Young Adult subject headings were used together when cataloging children's literature. And in 1996, the annotated card program converted to individual authority records in MARC 21 format, and in 2021, authority records were created for all children and young adult catalog subject headings, which is formally separated the children's and young adult catalogs from Library of Congress subject headings.
So my section of the presentation is the How is it implemented section. So as Amanda was saying, children's subject headings are exceptions to some regular Library of Congress subject headings that use heading subdivisions and cross-references. CSHs use popular terms instead of technical terms. The example in our textbook was imaginary playmates instead of imaginary companions. It just makes it a bit more approachable for children and makes it easier for them to find the resources that they're looking for. The children's subject headings should be used in conjunction with the Library of Congress subject headings. The reason why is being this example here. So holidays is in the Library of Congress subject headings, but not in the children's subject headings. However, holidays can be added as a subject heading to bibliographic records for children's materials because it already exists in the Library of Congress subject headings. These are helpful because they provide access to children's materials using terms and phrases that children would use and that are used in children's literature. Here I've got an example from the Cabarrus County Library online catalog. It is the system that I work for. And I've got a Geronimo Stilton book here, along with the subject terms list, as we call it. You can see here that some of the things are not completely up to the Library of Congress standards, such as including the terms juvenile, but a lot of the headings do have mice dash fiction, undercover operations dash fiction, and omit the juvenile part of it. If you could go to my next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight comes from the Library of Congress, the CYAC program, which is a Children and Young Adults cataloging program. So these catalogers implement CYAC and LOC subject cataloging policies and practices. This is a screenshot here of their website that goes through all of the children's subject headings, all of their standards, and all of just everything you can think of dealing with children's subject headings. The CYAC program catalogs items by creating bibliographic records, complete with children's subject headings and a brief non-critical summary to offer easier subject access to those materials. So they are just the bread and butter of children's subject headings. If you could go to my next slide, please. Thank you. So there's two different screenshots here. And one of them is subject cataloging with children's and young adult subject headings, and the other is the application of children's and young adult subject headings. I won't read everything, but some of the highlights here for the subject cataloging and how that's different from just the LOC subject headings. Hyphens are removed from headings like water supply, fortune telling, metalwork. Words and phrases that are redundant in a juvenile catalog are deleted. And common names of plants, animals, and diseases are often used instead of the scientific ones. Again, it's just more accessible for children to see things that they're familiar with as opposed to super heavy terms. And some headings and subdivisions are used instead of the LCSH equivalents, such as sports-fiction instead of sports stories, trees-planting instead of tree planting. If you could go to my next slide, please. Thank you. So a lot of the important work that the CYAC does also involves maintaining these standards. So monthly editorial meetings are held to ensure that these subject headings continue to be beneficial and approachable for children and for those that are cataloging children's material. If there's ever a need for a new subject heading, proposals are submitted but only when the topic of a resource cannot be indicated with an existing subject heading. And that proposal then goes through a process here, which I've got up on the screen, but it starts with the literature in the subject area being consulted. It runs through dictionaries. The index terms are checked in indexing sources. And then the Sears list of subject headings, which is commonly used in public and school libraries, is also consulted. You could go to my next slide, please. Thank you. This is just like a quick little blurb here, but it's a screenshot from the CYAC. Once again, everything was there. But this includes hierarchical references for the CYAC. So prior to July of 2021, catalogers were encouraged to just consult the Library of Congress subject headings for hierarchies because one did not exist for CYAC. So there are efforts currently underway to kind of create those terms instead of just using them like from this umbrella of the Library of Congress and giving them their own terms. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. I've got a list here. These things are in the scope for the CYAC program, and these down here are not in scope. So in scope are going to be your juvenile graphic novels, your poetry, fiction about realistic animals, etc. Not in scope are going to be things like folklore of Indigenous people of the Americas and plays for children and young adults. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then my last slide here. So to kind of keep up this work and maintain things, collaboration with outside organizations is necessary. So the CY does receive feedback on cataloging needs from the American Library Association's core division, which is their leadership, infrastructure, and features division, and the Library of Congress Rare Books and Special Collections, which also houses the Children's Literature Department of the Library of Congress. Yep, and that is my section.
Okay, so we know that the purpose for children's subject heading is to provide that bibliographic information in a language that is natural for children. So due to the fact that the Library of Congress acts as kind of a governing body for children's subject headings, then a lot of the current issues and debates among the children's subject headings mirror what is also being seen with the Library of Congress subject headings. Specifically for this presentation, we are going to focus on issues surrounding these three things: time and maintenance, so issues surrounding the proper maintenance of children's subject headings and time-intensive requirements. Number two, issues with subject heading assignment, so how are subjects selected and what challenges are faced within that process. And last, bias and subject heading language, so what biases are seen with children's subject headings and how are these challenges being met. If you could go to the next slide, please. All right, up first we have time and maintenance. So as of July 2021, there are authority records existing specifically for Library of Congress children's subject headings, even those that are duplicates of Library of Congress subject headings. So this adds another layer of in-depth understanding application that has to be applied when using these subject headings for children's collections and accessibility for children. So this is additional time spent on property cataloging these resources in an accessible language that follows that overarching guidelines of the Library of Congress subject headings. Also, there is proposals for adding new subject headings, which Isabella touched on, and updating existing subject headings, and that must be submitted and reviewed for changes. So this means that catalogers cannot simply use an authority record or subject heading that doesn't exist. This is problematic and requires a lot of time and waiting when materials are received that may be surrounding a subject that isn't found in the Library of Congress Children's Subject Headings, and kind of forcing catalogers to make a decision between what's available, but not necessarily what's best. And this also comes back to a time and maintenance issue when those changes are made about having to go back in and redo those records. You can go to my next slide, please. Okay, so subject heading assignment can be confusing when we look at how libraries are organizing their children's collections. So we already discussed how Library of Congress children's subject headings have specific characteristics that distinguish them from the Library of Congress subject headings in regards to their category assignments, and children's subject headings have their own authority records, causing that confusion when we're thinking about accessibility of how children are going to be looking at these. One of the main differences that you're going to notice is the removal of redundant wording, such as juvenile as a subdivision of children's subject headings. And if you'll go to the next slide, we'll briefly discuss that. So on this slide, we have screenshots from 2 catalogs for the same identical book. If we look at the top picture, we see it's from Craven County Schools, and that book is on pythons, and we see that the subjects that they're using is pythons in Africa, and we have lost that juvenile literature. But if we look below at ECU's catalog entry and their subject headings, we can see that they have pythons with juvenile literature, meaning that they're using the Library of Congress subject headings, whereas Craven County Schools is using Library of Congress children's subject headings. And if we think about this and the intended users for this, both of these are children's collections, but one is intended for children to access and one is intended for academic purposes at a university and a teaching resources center. So that can be kind of confusing when we're trying to figure out which way is best for accessibility when it comes to cataloging those books and which subject headings to use. If you could go to the next slide, please. Last up, we have bias and subject heading language. So subject headings surrounding specific topics do not exist until there is a need. So this is problematic when trying to assign topics to books when a subject heading doesn't exist that may be better suited. So if we look at these pictures, we have a book that is on challenge list frequently, and Tango Makes Three. And if we look at the subject headings in the East Carolina catalog and what's found in Craven County Schools, we see a lot of similarities. Again, penguins, zoo animals, familiar behavior in animals, and then homosexuality. However, if we think about this book and how children who are from families that had to take other reproductive means to start their family, this book does not reflect those children. And a lot of time parents, when they're looking for books, will often look at children's books to help them, but there's not a subject heading for accessibility for children when they're looking for books for donor offspring. So these types of language barriers create an issue when it comes to children finding materials that reflect themselves and accessibility on their end in language that they use for those purposes. And then our final slide is our references. If you would like to look more at the work that we've done and the sources that we used for this presentation, we appreciate your time and thank you for listening.